Victoria Hastings believed she had everything, power, wealth, and control over her own destiny. But in a single moment, everything shattered. A brutal crash, the scent of burning fuel, and the twisted wreckage of her once flawless world. As she lay trapped in her mangled car, unable to move, she thought it was the end. And then, out of the shadows, came a boy, small, ragged, and barely more than a ghost in the night. Malik Carter, a child no one noticed, a name that didn't exist in any system. But in that instant, he became the only person in the world who mattered. He pulled her from the wreckage, saving her life before disappearing into the streets without a trace. Who was he? Why had he risked everything for a woman like her? And why did every attempt to find him only uncover more questions? This isn't just a story about gratitude. It's about secrets buried in fire, a past rewritten in blood, and a truth so dangerous that powerful men would kill to keep it hidden, because Malik wasn't supposed to survive. And now that he had, Victoria would be forced to decide. Was she willing to risk everything to stand by his side? Stay until the end, because the truth is just beginning to surface. Before we start, tell us, where are you watching from? Victoria Hastings gripped the steering wheel of her Lamborghini so tightly that her manicured nails nearly dug into the leather. The deal had fallen apart, an empire-shaking failure that no one in her position could afford. Her jaw was clenched, her heartbeat a furious rhythm in her ears. She had built her name, her fortune, her power on control. Yet tonight, for the first time in years, she felt it slipping through her fingers like sand. The rain pounded the windshield, but she barely noticed. Her mind was consumed with the bitter taste of defeat, the betrayal of weak men who lacked vision. The city blurred past her in streaks of neon and shadow, her speed reckless, her thoughts even more so. And then it happened. A blinding flash of headlights, a force so violent that time seemed to fracture, the sickening sound of metal crumpling, glass shattering, her body being hurled against unforgiving surfaces, silence, then pain. She gasped, her ribs protesting with searing agony. Smoke curled around her, the acrid scent of gasoline thick in her nostrils. Panic clawed at her throat. The impact had twisted the car into a mangled cage, trapping her. Her seatbelt dug into her collarbone, the dashboard pressed against her legs. She turned her head, every movement agony, and through the jagged cracks in the windshield she saw people gathering, a blur of distant voices, the chaos of the city moving around her as if she were already a ghost. She tried to move, to call for help, but her throat was raw, her voice a whisper swallowed by the night. The fire would start soon. She could smell it, the death creeping closer. And then, just as her vision swam in and out of darkness, she saw him, a silhouette against the flashing lights, small, thin, moving with a purpose that didn't belong to a frightened bystander. The boy approached the wreckage, his bare feet splashing through puddles. His clothes were tattered, clinging to his rain-soaked frame, and his face, partially obscured by the grime of the city, was set with determination. He was no more than 12, yet his eyes carried a weight far beyond his years. She felt a jolt of disbelief. A child? In a moment like this? He pressed his palms against the cracked window, peering inside. Their eyes met. Something passed between them, something beyond logic, beyond explanation. Then, without hesitation, he raised his elbow and struck the glass. Once, twice. On the third hit, the window gave way, shards scattering into the cabin like fallen stars. Victoria tried to move, but her limbs were leaden, her breath shallow. The boy crawled through the wreckage, his hands gripping hers with a strength that should have been impossible for someone so small. "Come on," he muttered, his voice steady, unshaken by the destruction around them. "We gotta move." The world was spinning, her consciousness fraying at the edges. Her instincts rebelled. She was Victoria Hastings, a woman who commanded billion-dollar industries, who did not rely on anyone, let alone a street kid. But the fire was coming. She could hear the angry hiss of fuel leaking, the engine groaning under the weight of impending catastrophe. And in that moment, none of it mattered. Not pride, not power, only survival. With effort that nearly shattered her, she let him pull her out, each second an eternity. The moment they cleared the wreckage, a deafening explosion erupted behind them, a shockwave of heat and force knocking them to the ground. Her ears rang, her body screamed in protest, but she was alive, alive because of him. The boy was already on his feet, stepping back, blending into the chaos. Victoria struggled to sit up, her vision flickering between clarity and haze. Sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer. People were shouting, cell phones flashing in the dark, capturing every angle of the disaster. Except him. He wasn't there anymore, as if he had never been. She turned, searching the crowd, her breath hitching with something dangerously close to desperation. Who was he? How had he disappeared so fast? A paramedic knelt beside her, a flashlight cutting through the smoke. "Ma'am, can you hear me? You've been in an accident. Just stay still." Victoria barely registered the words, her fingers clenched weakly in the damp dirt, her pulse a frantic rhythm against her skin. The wreckage smoldered, the remnants of her past arrogance burning away in the flickering light. And somewhere in the darkness, a boy with nothing had just saved a woman who once thought she had everything, and no one had seen him do it. Victoria's eyes snapped open, her breath catching in her throat as she was pulled from unconsciousness into the blinding, sterile brightness of the hospital room. Her body screamed in protest as she shifted slightly, a sharp, stabbing pain radiating from her ribs, making her teeth clench. The antiseptic stench mixed with something faintly metallic, the remnants of blood, perhaps her own. But none of that mattered as much as the low, incessant murmur beyond the door, a restless, hungry hum of voices pushing against the walls, desperate to break through. Journalists. They were out there, waiting like vultures circling the wounded, eager for a glimpse of the woman who had barely escaped death. She took a slow, measured breath, but the sharp pain in her ribs forced her to stop halfway. Her mind was still catching up, memories slipping through like shards of broken glass. The explosion, the boy, the faceless figure who had pulled her from the wreckage, vanishing into the night before she could even speak his name. Malik. No, she hadn't spoken his name because she never asked for it, and now the world had decided that was her greatest sin. The door swung open with a force that made her flinch, and Richard Lawson stormed in, his face taut with tension, his usually impeccable suit slightly wrinkled, a sign of the chaos that had clearly unfolded while she was unconscious. His grip was firm around the tablet in his hands, his jaw locked in frustration. He didn't bother with pleasantries, didn't ask how she was feeling. That alone told her everything she needed to know. "It's worse than we thought," he said without preamble, his voice low but urgent. Victoria didn't respond immediately. She reached for the cup of water on the bedside table, took a sip to soothe the dryness in her throat, and finally lifted her gaze to him. "I nearly died last night, Richard. That seems like a problem worth addressing first, don't you think?" Her tone was flat, unimpressed. But Richard wasn't shaken. He tossed the tablet onto her lap, the screen already lit up with screaming headlines. "Billionaire survives fiery crash, ignores young hero." Another below it, "Victoria Hastings, too rich to say thank you." The words struck harder than she expected, not because they were true, but because they had already spread like wildfire. She picked up the tablet, scrolling through the damage, news anchors dissecting her expression in blurry footage, body language analysts calling her cold, detached, inhuman. Social media was even worse. Video clips of the crash site were everywhere, replaying the moment her limp, bloodied form was dragged from the wreckage. Only in those clips he was missing. The boy who had saved her life, the only person who had been close enough to truly know the fear in her eyes, had slipped away unnoticed. And now, his absence had become the story. A faceless, nameless child who had done what no one else had dared to risk himself for. Her, and she had simply left, or at least that was how the public saw it. "I don't see why this matters," she muttered, tossing the tablet aside, though the weight of its contents pressed against her ribs harder than the bruises. "So what? I'm not obligated to fall at the feet of every stranger who crosses my path. He's a kid. He ran off before I could say anything. End of story." Richard let out a sharp breath, rubbing a hand over his face, as if reining in the urge to shake some sense into her. "It isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning. Clients are pulling out of contracts. Investors are reconsidering their stakes in the company. There are protests outside the office. For years, you've controlled the narrative, Victoria, but right now, you're losing it." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "And you know what happens when you lose control. People start rewriting your story for you." She hated that he was right. She had spent decades building an empire, clawing her way to the top, ensuring that her version of events was the only one that ever mattered. But this was different. This wasn't some boardroom scandal or a corporate power play. This was emotional, raw, public, and public opinion was a beast she had never had to tame before. She sat up, ignoring the fire in her ribs, her mind already working through contingencies. "Fine," she said, her voice sharp, controlled. "What's the solution?" Richard studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching for something, perhaps humanity, perhaps just an ounce of genuine concern. But whatever it was, he didn't find it. Still, he answered, "We find him. The kid, Malik, or whatever his name is. We bring him in, clean him up, put him in front of cameras, and let you play the part of the grateful survivor." He exhaled slowly. "And if we don't find him, you can kiss your reputation goodbye." The weight of his words settled over her like an iron cage. For the first time in her life, she wasn't being asked to make a deal. She was being forced into one. She pushed herself to her feet, steadying against the bedside table as a wave of dizziness threatened to pull her back down. Richard watched her carefully, but didn't move to help. He knew better. Victoria Hastings didn't need help. That was the foundation she had built herself on, and she wasn't about to let it crack now. "Find him," she said finally, her voice devoid of hesitation. Richard nodded, already pulling out his phone, already setting things into motion. But as he turned to leave, she added, "And when you do." She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I will decide how this plays out. Not the press, not the public. Me." She didn't. Wait for his response. She simply turned toward the window where the city awaited, already sharpening its knives. Victoria paced across the polished marble floor of her penthouse, her phone pressed tightly against her ear as frustration burned through her veins. "Are you telling me," she said, her voice dangerously calm, "that a child who physically pulled me from a burning car doesn't exist?" The private investigator on the other end of the line hesitated, and that alone sent irritation clawing at her patience. "I'm saying there's no trace of him," the man finally admitted. "No school records, no guardian, no known address. It's like he vanished into thin air." Victoria exhaled sharply, her grip tightening around the phone. "People don't just vanish. Find him." She ended the call before he could respond, tossing the phone onto the sleek glass table beside her. This was impossible. She had spent her life tracking down elusive business partners, breaking apart corporate empires brick by brick, bending the world to her will. And yet a 12-year-old boy, a street kid, was slipping through her fingers as if he had never existed at all. She turned, her gaze sweeping over the panoramic view of the city that sprawled beneath her. It looked different now. The buildings, the endless rows of traffic, the millions of lives that moved without ever touching hers. It all felt suddenly foreign, like she was seeing it through someone else's eyes. His eyes. Malik had lived somewhere down there, in the parts of the city she had never stepped foot in, places that existed only as distant. Problems, statistics she skimmed past in reports about crime rates and economic disparity. Now she had no choice but to walk through them herself. The idea was almost laughable. Victoria Hastings, billionaire CEO, stepping into the streets like a commoner. But what choice did she have? The headlines were still bleeding across every major network. The pressure from her board was suffocating. And most infuriating of all, she hated loose ends. Malik was a loose end. Her driver hesitated when she gave him the address. "Are you sure, Mom?" he asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. She met his gaze coldly. "Drive." The car moved smoothly at first, but as they crossed into the poorer districts, the contrast became glaring. Glass skyscrapers gave way to crumbling brick buildings. Neon signs flickered above corner stores that looked half abandoned, and sidewalks were littered with more than just trash. There was exhaustion in the air, a weight that settled over everything like a dull haze. This was a world she had never truly acknowledged, not beyond the carefully curated charity events where her donations were met with applause and gratitude. Here, there were no press conferences, no thank you speeches, just survival. When the car stopped, she stepped out, her designer heels clicking against uneven pavement, an instant reminder that she didn't belong here. She moved through the streets with a purpose, ignoring the stares, the murmurs that followed her. A woman in tailored clothes, dripping with wealth, was an anomaly in a place like this. She approached a small bodega, the kind that sold everything from cigarettes to prepaid phone cards, and stepped inside. Behind the counter, an older man looked up, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "You lost?" he asked gruffly. Victoria didn't flinch. "I'm looking for a boy, about 12, thin, dark skin, answers to Malik." The man's expression didn't change. "Don't know him." She exhaled sharply, her patience thinning. "He saved my life. I just need to talk to him." The man studied her for a long moment, before finally shaking his head. "If he don't want to be found, you won't find him." He gestured toward the door. "You're wasting your time, lady." She left without another word, stepping back into the streets, her frustration growing with every passing second. The same answer repeated itself over and over, from shop owners, street vendors, people who barely glanced up from their business. No one knew Malik, or if they did, they weren't talking. She was ready to leave, to declare this a dead end, when a voice stopped her. "You're looking for the boy who saved you?" Victoria turned, her gaze locking onto an elderly woman sitting on a stoop, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was small, wrapped in layers of worn fabric, her eyes sharp despite her age. Victoria hesitated before nodding. "Do you know him?" The old woman chuckled softly. "Everyone knows Malik, but knowing him and finding him, two different things." Victoria frowned, stepping closer. "Where does he live?" The woman tilted her head. "Wherever he can. An old warehouse one night, a back alley the next. He keeps moving, always has." Victoria absorbed the information, her mind already working through strategies. "Why?" The old woman gave her a long, measuring look before responding. "Because trusting people gets you hurt. And for boys like him, it gets you killed." Her words were quiet, matter of fact, but they landed like a stone in Victoria's chest. There was something unsettling about the certainty in her voice. "But if he saved you," the woman continued, leaning forward slightly, "then he saw something in you that no one else does." Victoria stiffened at that, the words cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. Because if that were true, if Malik had looked at her and seen something worth saving, then why did she feel like the rest of the world only saw the opposite? Victoria moved with purpose, her heels clicking sharply against the uneven pavement as she maneuvered through the narrow alleyways of the city's forgotten districts. She had spent days searching, sending investigators, bribing informants, even stepping into places she would have once considered beneath her. And yet, Malik had remained a ghost, slipping through every attempt to pin him down. Until now, Her sources had finally led her to this place, an alley wedged between two crumbling buildings, where the scent of neglect clung to the walls and the shadows stretched long. But it wasn't the setting that stopped her. It was the sight before her. Malik stood there, small yet commanding, surrounded by children even younger than himself. They huddled together, their clothes worn, their faces wary. He wasn't just surviving, he was protecting. And when he turned to face her, there was no shock, no fear, only the knowing glint in his dark eyes. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice steady, almost amused. "People like you always come back." Victoria wasn't used to being read so easily, least of all by a child. Her entire career had been built on unpredictability, on controlling the narrative before anyone else could. But Malik, he saw through it, through her, in a way that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She took a slow step forward, ignoring the way the younger children stiffened, their small hands gripping whatever scraps of security they had left. She reached into her coat, pulling out a crisp stack of bills. "I owe you," she said simply, extending the money toward him. "Take it." Malik didn't even look at it. His expression remained unchanged, his arms loosely crossed over his chest. "You think I saved you for that?" His voice held no anger, just certainty, as if he had expected nothing less from her. And that, more than anything, made something twist uncomfortably in her chest. She wasn't used to rejection. People bent for her. They scrambled to please her. They took what she offered without hesitation. But Malik, he was different. What do different? "You want then?" she asked, lowering the money but not yet withdrawing the offer completely. Malik tilted his head slightly, studying her with the same unreadable expression he had worn the night of the crash. Respect. The word landed between them like a challenge. The concept was foreign too. Her, not because she didn't understand it, but because she had never been asked for it in this way. Respect in her world was something earned through power, through dominance, through control. But Malik wasn't asking for the kind of respect that came with contracts and negotiations. He wanted something deeper. "And what does that mean to you?" she asked, genuinely curious for the first time in longer than she could remember. Malik exhaled slowly, as if he had already expected her not to understand. "It means you stop looking at me like I'm some problem to fix," he said. "It means you stop acting like your money makes you better than me." He gestured toward the children behind him. "It means realizing that not everything can be bought." Victoria had spent years in boardrooms, negotiating deals with men twice her age, dismantling competitors with nothing more than a well-placed silence. But this was different. This was a battle she hadn't prepared for, an opponent she couldn't predict. She had come here expecting to close a transaction, to settle a debt. Instead, she was being confronted with something she had never had to consider before. She could walk away. She could leave Malik and his world behind. Let the media frenzy die down. Let this entire experience fade into a forgettable inconvenience. But something in her hesitated. Why? The question gnawed at her, unfamiliar and unwelcome. She had never been sentimental, never wasted time on things that didn't serve her purpose. And yet, she wasn't moving. Malik studied her, as if waiting for her to speak. But when she didn't, he finally broke the silence. "You don't want to know why I did it?" The question was simple, but it held weight. A test. A moment that demanded something from her beyond money, beyond control. She should have dismissed it. She should have walked away. But instead, she found herself hesitating. And for the first time in her life, Victoria Hastings realized she did want to know. Victoria sat in her office, the glow of her computer screen illuminating the stark lines of her face. The search results stared back at her, empty and defiant. No birth certificate, no school records, no hospital visits, nothing. Malik Carter did not exist, not in any way that could be traced, recorded, or explained. It was impossible. People do not simply exist outside the system. And yet, here he was, breathing, moving, defying every attempt she had made to pin him down. She had seen him with her own eyes, felt his hands drag her from the wreckage of her car. But according to every database, every legal document she had access to, the boy who had saved her was nothing more than a ghost. Frustration clawed at her as she reached for the phone on her desk and dialed a number she had never thought she would use. It rang twice before the familiar voice of James Carter answered. "You must be desperate, Victoria," he said, his tone laced with amusement. "I can't remember the last time you asked for help." She ignored the bait. "I need you to find someone for me," she said, leaning back in her chair. "A boy, around 12, name's Malik Carter. No records, no known family. Nothing." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Carter?" James repeated, his voice sharper now. "That's an interesting coincidence." Victoria frowned. "Why?" A rustling sound came through the speaker, the unmistakable noise of James rifling through files. "Because I've seen that name before," he muttered. "A long time ago." Victoria's pulse quickened. "Explain." There was another pause, heavier this time. "I'll send you something," he said finally, "but you're not going to like it." The call ended abruptly, leaving Victoria gripping the phone tighter than necessary. She didn't like cryptic answers. She liked facts, numbers, data, but something about the hesitation in James's voice unsettled her in a way she couldn't shake. Minutes later, an email notification popped onto her screen. She clicked it, her eyes scanning the subject line. Case file, 90823, Ashwood Orphanage, fire. Her breath hitched slightly as she opened the attachment. The first image was an old newspaper clipping. "Fire destroys orphanage. Multiple casualties. No survivors identified." Beneath it, a grainy black and white photo of smoldering ruins. The remains of a once-standing building reduced to nothing but ash and charred wood. But it was the second image that made her stomach tighten. A photograph. A group of children standing in front of the orphanage before the fire had stolen everything from them. And there, at the very edge of the frame, partially obscured by shadow, stood a boy. Small, thin, dark eyes staring directly at the camera with an expression that sent a chill through her. It was him, Malik. Her fingers hovered over the screen, disbelief momentarily freezing her thoughts. It didn't make sense. If this photo was from 10 years ago, Malik would have been barely 2 years old at the time. But the boy in the image, he looked older than that. He looked exactly the same as he did now. The realization sent a jolt through her. It wasn't just that he had survived the fire, it was that he hadn't changed. Not in a decade. It was impossible. It had to be. She quickly scrolled through the rest of the file, scanning for anything that could explain it, but every piece of evidence led to a dead end. The orphanage had been shut down before the fire, its records mysteriously lost. No known survivors, no clear cause for the blaze, just a forgotten tragedy, buried and left to fade from memory, until now. Her phone rang again, breaking the eerie silence of the office. "James," she answered on the first ring. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice colder than before. "I was hoping you could tell me," he admitted. "Because that boy, if he really is Malik Carter, then he shouldn't exist." Victoria's grip tightened around the device. "People keep saying that," she muttered, "but here's the problem, he does." James exhaled on the other end, the sound filled with something Victoria didn't often hear from him: uncertainty. "You need to be careful," he warned. "Some things are buried for a reason. If you start digging too deep, you might not like what you find." She should have hung up, ignored the weight of his words, dismissed them as paranoia. But her gaze lingered on the photograph, her mind racing with too many unanswered questions. For the first time in a long time, Victoria Hastings felt something she hadn't in years. Not fear, not doubt, something worse, curiosity. Victoria sat stiffly in her office, staring at the faded photograph still displayed on her laptop screen. The boy in the image, standing at the edge of the orphanage group, was Malik. It had to be, but it didn't make sense. If the fire happened 10 years ago, if there were no survivors, then how was he standing before her now, unchanged? The questions twisted in her mind, colliding with her growing unease. She had spent her career solving problems, cutting through obstacles with brutal efficiency. But this wasn't a problem that could be reasoned with. It was something else entirely. Before she could lose herself further in the spiral of questions, a sharp buzz from her phone pulled her back. A message from James. "We need to talk. Something isn't right." Victoria exhaled, setting her jaw. No kidding. She was about to respond when a second message popped up. This one wasn't from James. It was an alert from her security system. Someone was at her front gate. Her stomach tensed as she stood, moving toward the security monitor mounted on the wall. The screen flickered to life, showing the dark street outside her estate. A figure stood just beyond the iron gate, barely, illuminated by the street lamp's weak glow, small, unsteady, and then the camera adjusted, sharpening the image. Malik. But something was wrong. He was hunched over, one arm clutching his side, his clothes torn, dark stains spreading across the fabric. Even through the grainy screen, she could see his chest rising and falling in short, labored breaths. She didn't think. She acted. Grabbing her coat, she rushed to the door, disabling the alarm as she yanked it open and stepped outside. He lifted his head slightly at the sound, his expression unreadable. "You're hurt," she said, the observation slipping out before she could stop it. He smirked, but it was weak, strained. "Yeah," he muttered, "figured that out on my way here." She reached the gate and punched in the code to unlock it. The second it clicked open, Malik took a shaky step forward, but his legs faltered beneath him. Victoria moved instinctively, catching him before he hit the ground. His body tensed against hers, as if the idea of accepting help was foreign, but he was too weak to resist. She braced herself under his weight, half guiding, half carrying him inside. "You shouldn't have come here," she murmured as they crossed the threshold, closing the door behind them. "Didn't have much of a choice," he muttered. "People like me don't get safe places." Something in his voice made her pause. It wasn't just exhaustion. It wasn't just pain. It was something else, something she had never heard from him before. Fear. She led him into the living room, lowering him onto the couch before stepping back to assess the damage. His face was bruised, a fresh cut just above his brow, still bleeding sluggishly. His shirt was torn at the side, revealing dark bruises forming across his ribs. "Who did this to you?" she asked. Her voice sharper than she intended. Malik let out a rough breath, leaning his head back against the couch. "Two guys. Big, strong. Didn't ask questions. Just grabbed me." His fingers curled slightly as if remembering the struggle. "They knew my name." Victoria felt a chill crawl up her spine. What did they want? He hesitated, his gaze flicking to her before settling somewhere past her shoulder. "They wanted to take me." His voice was quiet now, but the weight in his words pressed against her like a vice. She swallowed hard, pushing past the knot forming in her chest. "And you got away?" Malik let out a short, bitter laugh. "I ran, got lucky, didn't have anywhere else to go." Victoria had seen a lot in her life. Greedy men, ruthless competitors, scandals that could destroy entire empires. But this was different. This wasn't a boardroom battle or a power play. This was real, raw survival. And for the first time, she felt something unexpected stir inside her. Anger, not at Malik, but at the fact that someone, somewhere, had decided a child was disposable. She grabbed the first aid kit from the drawer and returned to his side. "Let me see," she said, kneeling beside him. He eyed her warily, but after a moment he relented, allowing her to push his torn shirt aside. The bruises were deep, spreading along his ribs like a cruel reminder of whatever had happened before he reached her. She worked in silence, dabbing at the cut on his forehead, bandaging what she could. His eyes never left her, watching as if trying to figure out why she was doing this. After a while, he finally spoke. "You don't want to ask me." She paused, her hands stilling against his skin. "Ask you what?" Malik's gaze met hers, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw the hesitation. The vulnerability. "Who I really am." She opened her mouth, ready to say something dismissive, to push past whatever strange emotions were threading through her. But then she saw it, the thing that stopped her cold: fear. Not bravado, not defiance. Real, genuine fear. And suddenly, she realized she wasn't sure if she even wanted to know the answer. Victoria sat across from Malik, her hands clasped together tightly as she tried to process what he had just said. The words hung between them like a knife, sharp and dangerous, waiting for someone to reach out and grab it. She had spent her life making sense of things, bending reality to fit within. The structures she understood: money, power, influence. But this was something else. She wasn't in control here. She wasn't dictating the terms of the conversation. And Malik, despite his bruised face and the exhaustion in his eyes, knew it. He leaned back on the couch, one arm draped across, his ribs, his movements careful but not weak. "The fire," he repeated, his voice calm but firm. It wasn't an accident. She didn't respond right away, choosing instead to study him, to look for any sign of doubt. There was none. He wasn't speculating. He wasn't reaching for attention or sympathy. He was telling her a fact, one that had shaped his entire existence. "That was 10 years ago," she finally said, measuring her words. "You were just a kid." Malik exhaled through his nose, his gaze lowering slightly, as if he'd already anticipated her skepticism. "I was 5, he admitted, "but I remember it. Not just the fire, what happened before." He shifted, wincing slightly, but continued. "Ashwood wasn't a good place. It wasn't one of those orphanages that rich people donate to so they can sleep better at night. It was the kind where kids disappear and no one asks questions." Victoria frowned. This was beyond anything she had expected. She had assumed Malik was another casualty of the system, a forgotten child who had learned to fend for himself. But this, the way he spoke, the weight behind his words, it wasn't just a bad childhood. It was something more. "Disappear," she echoed. What do you mean?" Malik's jaw tightened for a second before he spoke again. "Some kids would leave," he said, "or at least that's what we were told, but they never came back, never sent letters. No one ever said their names again. At first, we thought they were getting adopted, but then it started happening too often. Too many kids, too many questions that no one wanted to answer." He rubbed his hands together absently, a nervous habit before continuing. "And then, one night, the fire started." Victoria's pulse quickened. She wasn't the type to believe in conspiracies. The world worked on greed, not ghosts. But Malik's certainty, the absolute conviction in his voice, made something cold settle in her chest. "What do you remember about that night?" she asked, keeping her tone even. Malik exhaled slowly, as if dragging the memories up from a place he had buried them long ago. "We woke up to the smell of smoke," he said. "At first, we thought it was just one of the older kids messing around, but then the alarms went off and the halls filled with people running. I remember hearing screaming from the girls' dorm. Someone was trying to break the door down. I remember one of the staff yelling something. It's not supposed to spread this fast," like they weren't expecting it to get out of control. Victoria's fingers curled slightly against her lap. That detail stuck with her. Fires didn't spread faster than expected unless someone had planned for them not to. "And you got out," she murmured. Malik nodded. "I ran. A few of us did, but not everyone made it." His voice dropped, something haunted flickering across his expression before he pushed it down. "They said there were no survivors, but I know some of the kids made it out. I know because I saw them. I just never saw them again." Victoria narrowed her eyes slightly. "You think someone covered it up?" It wasn't a question. Malik looked at her then, holding her gaze with a steady, unflinching intensity. "I know they did," he said, "and now they know I survived." The weight of his words settled over her, like a storm cloud. She had spent the last few days trying to make sense of Malik, trying to fit him into a world where everything had a price, where survival was a matter of strategy. But this wasn't about survival anymore. This was about something bigger. "Who do you think they are?" she asked. Malik let out a breath, running a hand through his hair. "That's the problem," he admitted. "I don't know, but whoever they are, they're not just some random thugs. They found me once. They'll find me again." His voice was steady, but there was something in his eyes that made her pause. For the first time, she saw it. Fear, not just of what had happened, but of what was coming. Victoria had never been afraid of a challenge. She had built her empire on tearing down obstacles, on proving that nothing was beyond her control. But this was different, because for the first time in her life, she was looking at a problem that couldn't be solved with money or power. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she was the one holding the cards, and that realization unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Victoria stood in front of the television, arms crossed, her jaw tightening as she watched the man on the screen. Richard Monroe, in his tailored suit, stood before a podium, flashing that same carefully measured smile she had seen 100 times before. He exuded confidence, a seasoned manipulator who knew exactly how to shape public perception. The banner behind him read, "Monroe Foundation, a new future for the city's forgotten children." The irony nearly made her laugh. "That bastard," she muttered under her breath. Malik, sitting on the couch behind her, glanced up but said nothing. He didn't have to. She could feel his eyes on her, watching, measuring, just as she was doing to Monroe now. The speech was flawless. He spoke of change, of hope, of responsibility. Words she herself had used in boardrooms, in public statements when she needed to hide the less savory parts of her. Empire, it was all calculated, all rehearsed, but for the first time in a long time, Victoria wasn't on the other side of the deception. She was the one being deceived. Her phone buzzed on the counter. Without looking away from the screen, she reached for it, already knowing who it was. "Tell me something useful," she said as she answered. James Carter's voice was steady but laced with urgency. "You're not going to like it." That was never a good start. Victoria forced herself to stay composed, even as Monroe's voice droned on in the background. "Try me." There was a pause, a rustling of papers, and then James spoke again. Richard Monroe was one of the main financial backers of Ashwood Orphanage before it burned down. Not just a donor, the donor. He practically owned the place. Victoria's grip tightened around the phone. "That doesn't make sense," she said. "Why would he fund it? Just to destroy it?" James let out a breath. "That's the question, isn't it? Whatever happened that night, Monroe either wanted it covered up or he didn't want those kids alive to talk about it." Victoria turned away from the TV, processing the information. It wasn't just about Malik anymore. This was bigger. Much bigger. "What else?" she pressed. James hesitated for half a second, just long enough for her to know he was holding back something worse. "There was a police report," he said finally, "filed a few months before the fire. Complaints from an anonymous source about children going missing from Ashwood. The case was shut down before it even got looked into." Victoria's stomach twisted. "Monroe couldn't confirm," James admitted, "but given his reach, if he wanted it buried, it stayed buried." She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to keep her thoughts in check. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they were forming was one she wasn't sure she wanted to see. She ended the call without another word, tossing the phone onto the counter. Turning back to Malik, she expected him to ask what was happening. Instead, he just nodded, as if he already knew. "Monroe," he said quietly, "you know him." It wasn't a question. Victoria studied him for a moment before answering. "I've dealt with him before," she admitted. "He's not the kind of man who gets his hands dirty. He pays other people to do it." Malik didn't react. He simply leaned forward, resting, his elbows on his knees. "Then he paid someone to burn that place down." His voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something Victoria recognized all too well. Not fear, not anger, focus. He wasn't just looking for answers. He was preparing for something. Victoria sat across from him, clasping her hands together. "You need to understand something," she said. "Monroe isn't just another businessman. He's got connections in places people don't even know exist. If he's involved in this, it means two things. One, he's covering something up that's worth killing for. And two, she paused, choosing her words carefully. If he finds out you're still alive, he won't let that stand. Malik met her gaze without hesitation. I know. That was what unnerved her the most. He knew. He had lived in the shadows of this secret for years, waiting for the day it would catch up to him. Then why tell me? She asked, and for the first time, she realized the answer before he even gave it, because he trusted her. Maybe not completely, maybe not yet, but enough to let her in. Enough to let her see him. I don't want you to go public with this yet, he said. It wasn't a plea, it was a statement. Victoria raised an eyebrow. That's not how this works. If we want to take Monroe down, not yet, he interrupted. If we move too fast, we lose. He leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. People like him. They see everything before it happens. They plan for it. You go after. Him now, and he shuts everything down before you even get close. Victoria hated that he was right. She had spent her life operating in a world of strategy, of long games and patience. Monroe wouldn't be taken down by a press conference. This had to be done carefully, deliberately. She sighed, rubbing her temples. Fine, she said, but make no mistake, Malik, when we go after him, we finish this. Malik studied her for a long moment before nodding, and just like that, an unspoken agreement passed between them. They were in this together. Victoria didn't hesitate as she pushed through the elegant doors of Monroe's newest high-end charity event, her posture poised, her steps calculated. The room was filled with the city's most powerful players, each one engaged in their own subtle battles, their words carefully chosen weapons in a war. No one acknowledged out loud. She had played this game before, had mastered it, and tonight she would use it to her advantage. Monroe was near the center of the room, his laughter smooth, his presence commanding. He was surrounded by people desperate for his attention, eager to bask in the illusion of his generosity. Victoria had seen it before, the way men like him operated, hiding behind philanthropy, using charity as a shield. But tonight, she wasn't here to expose him. Not yet. Tonight, she was here to make him believe she was still the same woman she had always been. She approached with the grace of someone who had never known rejection, her expression perfectly neutral, her voice just warm enough to suggest familiarity without attachment. "Richard," she greeted, offering a knowing smile as he turned toward her. His expression barely flickered, just the briefest shadow of surprise. Before it was gone, replaced by the same charming smirk he always wore in public. "Victoria Hastings," he drawled, lifting his glass in a mock toast. "I was wondering when you'd show up." She tilted her head slightly, feigning amusement. "And miss another one of your grand performances? That wouldn't be like me." The words were light, teasing, but they carried an edge Monroe couldn't ignore. His eyes narrowed just a fraction, enough to tell her he was already trying to figure out why she was really there. "I thought you were too busy rebuilding your public image to care about events like these," he said smoothly. "But I suppose even the mighty Victoria Hastings knows when to pick her battles." She didn't let the comment sting, even though she knew exactly what he was implying. The scandal surrounding her accident, her supposed ingratitude, the way the media had turned against her, it was all still fresh, still a weakness Monroe could exploit if given the chance, but she wouldn't give him one. Not tonight. "Public perception is a funny thing," she replied easily. "One moment, you're untouchable. The next, you're a villain. But we both know how fickle the world is, don't we?" Monroe's smile deepened, his amusement genuine now. "That we do." He gestured toward the ballroom. "So tell me, Victoria, what brings you here? Surely not my little passion project." He was testing her, gauging her response. She met his gaze without hesitation. "I wanted to see it for myself," she said, letting just enough curiosity seep into her voice. "You've always had a way of reinventing yourself, Richard. I have to admit, I'm intrigued." Monroe chuckled, pleased by the flattery, even if he didn't fully believe it. That was the thing about men like him. They always wanted to be admired even by those they considered rivals. "Then let me give you a tour," he offered smoothly, extending a hand toward the grand hall beyond. Victoria hesitated for only a second before nodding, allowing him to lead her deeper into his world. Every step she took, she felt the weight of the choice she was making. She could have exposed him right then and there, could have turned the cameras on him and demanded answers. But that wasn't how the game was played. If she wanted to take him down, she had to do it right. She had to do it completely. Back at her estate, Malik paced restlessly, his jaw tight, his fingers curled into fists at his sides. He hated this, hated the waiting, the uncertainty, the fact that Victoria was out there walking straight into Monroe's den, pretending to be something she wasn't. He understood strategy. He had spent his whole life running, learning when to hide, when to fight. But this was different. This wasn't just about survival anymore. "She's playing with fire," he muttered, shaking his head. He turned to face James, who sat calmly on the couch, watching him with the patience of someone who had seen far too much. "You think she knows what she's doing?" Malik demanded. James exhaled, leaning back slightly. "Victoria Hastings doesn't take risks she can't control," he said, "but that doesn't mean she won't get burned." Malik let out a frustrated breath, running a hand over his face. "She thinks she can outmaneuver him," he said, his voice quieter now. "That she can get close, find the cracks in his armor. But Monroe isn't just another businessman. He's dangerous." James studied him for a moment before speaking again. "And you care what happens to her?" Malik tensed at the words, his shoulders tightening. "I care what happens if she loses," he muttered. But the truth was, it was more than that. Victoria had done something no one else had ever done. She had listened. She had believed him. And now she was putting herself at risk because of it. The sound of a car pulling up outside made them both freeze. Malik moved first, crossing the room swiftly, peering through the curtains. His stomach twisted at what he saw. A black sedan parked just beyond the gate. The same car that had been following Victoria for days. The same men who had attacked him. "They're still watching us," he said, his voice low. James stood, his expression unreadable. "Then we don't have much time." Malik clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. "She needs to know." James nodded. "Then let's make sure she gets back in one piece." Hours later, when Victoria finally returned, Malik was waiting for her. She barely had time to set down her purse. Before he spoke, "You're making a mistake," he said. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I'm doing what needs to be done." Malik stepped closer, his voice quieter now. "I never believed in heroes," he admitted. "People like Monroe don't lose. People like you don't fight wars that aren't yours." Victoria's gaze didn't waver. "I don't believe in heroes either," she said, "but I believe in winning." And for the first time, Malik wondered if, just maybe, she was right. Victoria stormed into her office, slamming her handbag onto the desk as she pulled off her blazer with sharp, frustrated movements. She had spent the last hour in a meeting with the board, listening to carefully veiled concerns, subtle warnings that were anything but subtle. Monroe had made his move. She had expected it, had known it was coming the moment she stepped into his world, but she had underestimated just how quickly he would strike. Stock fluctuations, leaked reports, stories planted in the media about her company's declining leadership, contracts she had spent years securing. Now suddenly in limbo, Monroe was orchestrating a slow, deliberate unraveling of everything she had built. And the worst part? It was working. She poured herself a drink, her grip tightening around the glass as she stared out over the city. It was a view she had always loved. Power, control, a kingdom she had shaped with her own hands. But tonight it felt different, vulnerable, exposed. This wasn't about business anymore. It wasn't about profit margins or market influence. Monroe was making this personal. He wanted her to feel it, to know that she was no longer untouchable. A message, sent not through words, but through the slow suffocation of everything she valued. She had seen it happen to others, watched competitors fall under the weight of their own miscalculations. But she wasn't like them. She wouldn't lose. The door opened behind her, and she didn't need to turn to know it. Was James. His presence was heavy, serious. "It's worse than we thought," he said. "Monroe's not just going after the company, he's getting to the people around you." She set her glass down with deliberate precision. "Who?" James exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. "Your CFO just resigned. Effective immediately. Internal audit leaked. It makes it look like there's financial mismanagement even though there isn't. The media's already picking it up." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "Of course they are." She turned to face him, arms crossed. "And what about my staff?" James hesitated, which told her everything. "Two senior executives have been approached with offers they can't refuse. One of your assistants was seen meeting with a lawyer connected to Monroe's firm." He met her gaze. "Victoria, he's pulling every string he has. He wants you to fold." She shook her head. "Then he doesn't know me at all." But even as she said it, there was something gnawing at her, something she wasn't willing to admit out loud. Monroe wasn't just trying to dismantle her empire. He was testing her, pushing her to see how far she'd go. And the problem was, she didn't know the answer to that yet. How far would she go? What was the cost of winning this war? She was still mulling over the question when she arrived home later that night. The estate was quiet, the kind of silence that usually brought comfort after long days spent battling egos and sharks in suits. But as she approached the front door, something caught her eye. A small, folded piece of paper wedged neatly against the frame. The second she saw it, something in her stomach turned cold. Slowly, carefully, she reached for it, unfolding it with steady hands. The message was simple. If you continue this, the boy disappears forever. Her breath left her in a sharp exhale, fingers curling around the paper. The meaning was clear. Monroe wasn't just playing his usual game anymore. He had moved into dangerous territory, and he had found her weakness. Because it was a weakness, wasn't it? She could tell herself. It wasn't. Could pretend that Malik was just another problem to be solved, another piece of the puzzle she was trying to complete. But the truth was written in the way her pulse quickened, the way her vision sharpened as she looked around, searching for any sign that someone had been watching. He knew. Monroe had figured it out, that Malik mattered to her, that she cared, and that was leverage she could never afford to give anyone. She stepped inside, locking the door behind her as she moved through the house with practiced efficiency, checking windows, exits, every detail that had once been routine but now felt different, threatened. Malik was sitting on the couch when she found him, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He had seen it too. He knew. "They won't stop," he said quietly. It wasn't fear in his voice, just certainty. "Not until you back off." Victoria looked at him for a long moment, the weight of the decision settling over her. He was right. She could stop this, walk away, let Monroe win. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But as she met Malik's gaze, something in her refused to consider it. He had been running his whole life. She had spent hers, making sure she never had to. They were different, but in this moment, they were the same. "I'm not backing off," she said finally. Malik didn't blink. "Then you need to be ready," he warned. "Because Monroe doesn't lose." She exhaled slowly, folding the note in half before tucking it into her pocket. "Neither do I." But as she turned away, something unspoken passed between them. A realization, one that neither of them wanted to say out loud. This wasn't just about Monroe anymore. This was about them. Victoria's grip on the steering wheel was tight, her knuckles white from the pressure as she drove through the city, her mind racing faster than the car beneath her. Every instinct told her that Monroe was closing in, that he was done playing subtle games and was ready to strike where it hurt the most. He had already made his threats clear, but this was different. She had spent years navigating power plays, dodging corporate assassinations disguised as business rivalries, but nothing had ever felt quite like this. Because this time, it wasn't just her reputation, her empire, or her fortune at stake. It was Malik. and the thought of what Monroe might do to him made something cold and sharp coil in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She had spent the day trying to stay ahead of Monroe's attacks, countering the smear campaign he had unleashed on her company, keeping her board from panicking, making sure her assets were protected, but none of it mattered if she couldn't keep Malik safe. As much as she hated to admit it, he had become more than just a loose end in a mystery she was trying to solve. He was a person she refused to lose, and now she had to. Convince him of that before he made a mistake that would cost them both, because she knew him well enough by now to recognize the way his mind worked. He was already thinking about running. Again, when she finally pulled up in front of the estate, she barely had time to kill the engine before she spotted him standing by the front steps, hands shoved into his pockets, shoulders tense. He had been waiting. The moment she stepped out of the car, his eyes met hers, and she saw it. The doubt, the frustration, the quiet resignation that she had been dreading. "You don't have to say it," she said, before he could speak. "I already know what you're thinking." Malik's jaw clenched slightly. "Then you know I can't stay." His voice was steady, but there was something behind it, something that told her this wasn't a decision he wanted to make. It was one he thought he had to make. Victoria took a slow breath, forcing herself to remain calm, even as she felt her control slipping. "Running won't change anything," she said. "It never has." Malik exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You don't get it. If I leave, Monroe won't have a reason to come after you. He wants me, not you. If I disappear, this ends." She stepped closer, refusing to let him pull away from this. "No, it doesn't," she said firmly. "You think leaving makes you less of a target? It doesn't. It just makes you easier to catch." His gaze flickered, but she pressed on. "You said it yourself. Monroe doesn't lose. If he wants you gone, he'll find a way. But if you think for 1 second that I'm going to let you face that alone, you don't know me at all." Malik stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to gauge whether she was serious or just playing another angle. Then finally, he let out a breath. "Why?" The question was quiet, almost hesitant, and it made something twist inside her. "Why are you doing this?" Victoria didn't answer right away, because the truth was, she wasn't entirely sure. She had spent her entire life making decisions based on strategy, on logic, on what would benefit her in the long run. But this wasn't about logic. It was about something deeper, something she wasn't ready to put into words. "Because you're not alone in this," she said simply. "Not anymore." Before he could respond, the sound of tires against pavement caught their attention. Victoria's eyes snapped toward the street just in time to catch the tail lights of a black sedan vanishing around the corner. Instinct took over, and she moved fast, reaching for the gun she had started carrying since Monroe had made his first threat. But the car was already gone, disappearing into the night like a phantom. And then she saw it. The piece of paper lying on the sidewalk, weighted down by a small stone, as if left there intentionally. Her pulse pounded as she bent down to pick it up, unfolding it with careful hands. "You can't save him." The words were scrawled in sharp, deliberate strokes, a message not just meant for her, but for both of them. Malik was already looking over her shoulder, reading it at the same time she was. He didn't react, not outwardly, but she saw it in the way his hands curled into fists at his sides, the way his body went rigid, his jaw locking as he stared at the note like it was a challenge instead of a threat. "They're getting bolder," she murmured, folding the paper in half before slipping it into her pocket. "Which means they're getting desperate." Malik turned to her then, his expression unreadable. But when he spoke, his voice was steady, determined in a way she hadn't heard before. "I've spent my whole life running," he said. "Maybe it's time to stop." The words settled between them, heavier than any threat Monroe could have sent. And for the first time, Victoria realized that this wasn't just her fight anymore. It was theirs, and they were about to find out just how far Monroe was willing to go to end it. Victoria sat at her desk, scanning the article James had sent her, her fingers gripping the edges of the printed page, as if holding on to something solid could keep the truth from slipping away. The words blurred slightly as she read them over again, forcing herself to absorb every detail. Michael Lane, 47, was killed in what authorities described as an unfortunate accident when his car veered off the road and crashed into a ravine. Investigators ruled it as mechanical failure, but no further inquiries were made. That was it. That was all they wrote about the man who had just days before his death attempted to expose Monroe for siphoning money from the orphanage's funds. It was too clean, too convenient. She exhaled sharply, leaning back in her chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment before muttering under her breath, "This was never an accident, was it?" Across the room, Malik sat. On the couch, his legs stretched out, arms crossed, but his eyes were focused, locked onto her with the same quiet intensity he always had when the conversation turned toward Monroe. "So, what now?" he asked, voice steady, but carrying an edge of urgency. "We have proof he was stealing money, but that's not enough. That doesn't explain the fire, doesn't explain what happened to the kids." Victoria dropped the article onto her desk and picked up another file, one James had compiled after hours of digging. "No, but it gets us closer," she said. "Lane must have found something big, big enough, that Monroe needed him out of the picture. And before he died, he left those documents with a woman named Martha Reynolds. She worked at the orphanage for years. If anyone knows the truth, it's her." Malik sat up straighter at the name, his brow furrowing. "I remember her," he said slowly. "She was kind, not like the others. She used to sneak food to the kids who didn't get enough. She was always scared, though, always looking over her shoulder like she knew something she wasn't supposed to." Victoria nodded, absorbing his words. "Then she might still be in danger. If she has those documents, Monroe won't let her keep them." Malik hesitated, something flickering across his face. "If she's still alive," he said quietly. Victoria didn't let the thought settle. "Then we find her before he does." James's research had given them an address, a small, run-down apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't the kind of place someone like Victoria Hastings was used to stepping into, but she didn't hesitate as they pulled up outside, parking a few buildings down to avoid drawing attention. The place was old, the kind of forgotten space where people disappeared without anyone noticing. She stepped out of the car first, adjusting the coat draped over her shoulders, feeling the weight of the situation settle deeper into her bones. Malik followed, his steps silent but purposeful beside her. He knew this world. He had lived in it, and right now she was relying on that more than she cared to admit. They approached the building cautiously, moving through the narrow hallways, past doors with peeling paint and faded numbers. When they reached apartment 3B, Victoria knocked firmly, stepping back just enough to not appear threatening but still hold control over the situation. There was no immediate answer. She knocked again. More silence. Then, just as Malik shifted beside her, they heard movement from the other side. A soft shuffle, like someone hesitating, unsure whether to answer. Victoria leaned in slightly. "Martha Reynolds," she called. "We need to talk." "It's about Michael Lane." The lock clicked, but the door only opened a fraction, just enough for them to see the wary, lined face of an older woman peering through the crack. Her eyes darted between them, lingering on Malik for half a second before returning to Victoria. "Go away," she said, voice hoarse, like someone who had spent years whispering rather than speaking. Victoria didn't move. "We know what Lane gave you," she said evenly. "We're not here to hurt you. We're here to stop Monroe." The woman stiffened at the name, her fingers tightening on the doorframe. Fear flashed in her eyes, real, raw fear. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "You don't know what you're messing with." Victoria stepped closer. "I think I do," she said, lowering her voice. "I know Monroe stole from the orphanage. I know he wanted something buried, and I know that fire wasn't just an accident. But we can't prove any of it without you. Martha hesitated, her gaze flickering to Malik again, and this time something softened in her expression. Recognition. "You were one of the kids," she murmured. "You survived." Malik met her eyes, and for the first time since they arrived, Victoria saw something in his face she hadn't before. A quiet vulnerability, a thread of memory pulling him back to a place he had spent years trying to forget. "Yeah," he said simply, "and I'm done running." Martha exhaled shakily, and after a long pause, unlatched the door fully, stepping back to let them. Inside, the apartment was small, cluttered with old papers, books stacked in uneven piles, half-packed boxes in the corners, as if she had been preparing to leave but never quite managed to. Victoria's gaze swept the room, taking in the signs of a life lived in fear. "Where are the documents?" she asked, keeping her voice steady but firm. Martha walked to a cabinet near the window, pulling out a thin, weathered envelope. "Lane told me to keep them safe," she said quietly. "Said they were proof, but proof of what I never knew. I was too scared to look." Victoria took the envelope carefully, weighing it in her hands. This was it, the missing piece. The thing Monroe had killed for had burned an entire orphanage to erase. Whatever was inside could be the key to everything, but before she could open it, a sound from outside made them all freeze. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate. Someone was coming. Martha's face went pale, her hands trembling as she stepped back. "He found me," she whispered. Malik's eyes snapped to Victoria's. "We need to go. Now." Victoria didn't hesitate. She grabbed Martha by the arm, pulling her toward the door, Malik already moving ahead to check the hallway. The game had just changed. Monroe wasn't waiting anymore, he was coming for them. Victoria tightened her grip on the steering wheel as the car moved steadily down the narrow, winding road leading to the outskirts of the small town where Martha Reynolds had been hiding. It was a place that barely existed on a map, forgotten by time, untouched by the chaos of the city. The air was thick with something she didn't like: uncertainty. She was used to control, used to knowing the next move before the game even started. But this was different. They weren't walking into a corporate war or a battle of influence. They were walking into something much deeper, much older, a story that had been buried long before either of them had realized they were part of it. And that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Malik sat in the passenger seat, silent, his gaze locked on the road ahead. He hadn't spoken much since they left the city, but she could feel the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. This wasn't just about Monroe anymore. It wasn't just about money, corruption, or even revenge. It was about something personal, something tied to a past he had spent his entire life trying to outrun. And now, for the first time, he was driving straight into it. "You don't have to do this," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the thick silence between them. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Yes, I do." There was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt, just certainty. And that was enough for her to say nothing else. The house was small, tucked away, behind a row of overgrown trees, its paint peeling, its windows covered with thick curtains. Victoria killed the engine, glancing at Malik before stepping out. Every instinct told her that Martha Reynolds had spent years living in fear, and from the looks of this place, she had never stopped running. She knocked once. No answer. Knocked again. This time there was movement behind the door, the faint rustle of hesitation. Then, slowly, it creaked open just enough for them to see the woman standing behind it. Martha Reynolds was older than Victoria expected, her frame thin, her face lined with years of worry. But it was her eyes that held Victoria's attention, sharp, wary, searching for danger even in the quiet. "Who are you?" she asked, voice hoarse from disuse. Victoria held up her hands, a gesture of peace. "My name is Victoria Hastings. This is Malik Carter. We're here because of Michael Lane." At the name, Martha flinched, her fingers tightening around the edge of the door. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, glancing around as if expecting someone to be watching. "If Monroe finds out, he already knows we're looking." Victoria interrupted, stepping closer. And that means you're running out of time. If you know something about what happened at Ashwood, now's the time to tell us. Martha hesitated, her gaze shifting to Malik for the first time. And in that moment, something changed. She stared at him, her lips parting slightly, a flicker of recognition flashing across her face. "I remember you," she murmured. Malik tensed beside Victoria, his posture shifting, his hands curling into loose fists. "You worked there," he said, his voice steady, but his eyes watching her carefully. Martha nodded, exhaling shakily. "For years," she admitted, "until the fire." Victoria stepped in, her patience running thin. "Tell us what you know," she pressed. "Why did Lane try to expose Monroe? What was really happening at that orphanage?" Martha swallowed hard, glancing behind her before slowly opening the door. "Come in," she said, "but once I tell you, there's no going back." Inside, the house was cluttered but clean, stacks of newspapers piled on the small wooden table, old photographs scattered across the shelves. She motioned for them to sit, but Victoria remained standing. She didn't want comfort, she wanted answers. Martha rubbed her hands together as if trying to warm herself despite the thick summer air. "Michael Lane found something he wasn't supposed to," she began. "Everyone thought Monroe was just using the orphanage to steal money, but that wasn't the real reason he wanted it." She hesitated, her eyes darkening. There was something else, something he needed to erase completely. Victoria's pulse quickened. "What?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Martha shook her head. "I don't know exactly, but I know that before Lane died, he gave me something to keep safe. He told me if anything happened to him, if he didn't make it, I had to make sure the truth got out." She reached into a drawer, pulling out a small, battered box. Slowly, she opened it, revealing an old USB drive. "This has everything Lane collected before they got to him," she said. "I never dared to look at it, but whatever's on here, it's why Monroe burned that orphanage to the ground." Victoria took the USB drive, feeling the weight of it in her palm. This was it, the missing piece, the thing Monroe had been trying to destroy for years. She exhaled, slipping it into her pocket before meeting Martha's gaze. "We'll protect you," she promised. "But we need to move. If Monroe finds out we were here..." A sound outside cut her off. A car engine, a door slamming. Martha's face drained of color. "He already has," she whispered. Victoria's mind snapped into action. "We need to go. Now!" Malik was already at the window, peering through the gap in the curtains. "Black SUV," he reported. "2 men, maybe more." Victoria grabbed Martha by the arm, pulling her toward the back door. "Is there another way out?" she demanded. Martha nodded shakily. "Through the kitchen. There's a path that leads to the road." Victoria turned to Malik. "Get her out." "Up here, I'll stall them." He hesitated, but she didn't give him a choice. "Go." Malik took Martha's arm, guiding her toward the kitchen as Victoria moved back toward the front door, her mind racing. Monroe wasn't playing games anymore. He wasn't waiting for them to make a mistake. He was coming for them now, in broad daylight, and that meant one thing. They were getting close to the truth. Victoria's fingers hovered over the laptop's keyboard as the files from the USB drive loaded onto the screen. A long list of documents, spreadsheets, and scanned reports filled the screen, some of them old, their edges blurred like they had been stored away for years. She exhaled slowly, knowing that whatever was inside these files would change everything. Beside her, Malik sat on the edge of the couch, his body tense, hands resting on his knees, but his eyes locked on the screen. He didn't say anything, but she could feel the energy radiating from him. The need to know, the fear of what they might find, the silent question of whether it was better to keep running or finally face the truth. But there was no turning back now. She clicked on the first file, an old government document, barely legible but still intact. A birth certificate. She expected to see Malik Carter on it, but the name written in faded ink wasn't his. Elias Monroe. Her breath caught in her throat as she processed the name, her mind racing to make sense of it. Malik leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he read the document. "That's not me," he said, shaking his head slightly, as if saying it aloud would make it true. Victoria didn't answer immediately. She clicked on another document, a hospital record, the same name, then another, a court filing from over a decade ago, and then, finally, a police report detailing the murder of a couple named Daniel and Alana Monroe. Malik's fingers clenched into fists as he read the report, his breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. "They were my parents?" His voice was barely above a whisper, a tremor running through it. I don't remember them." Victoria forced herself to stay calm, to process the information the way she always did, with logic, with control. "It looks like they were involved in a financial case against Monroe," she said, scrolling through the files. "They tried to expose him, but before they could, they were killed. The official report says it was a robbery gone wrong, but we both know that's a lie." She glanced at him, watching as he stared blankly at the screen, his entire world shifting in real time. "Someone hid you," she continued. "They changed your identity, put you in Ashwood under a false name, probably hoping to keep you off Monroe's radar. But when he found out, he burned it down." Malik finished, his voice raw, his eyes dark with realization. "He wanted to erase any trace of me." The weight of the truth settled over them like a storm, thick and suffocating. Malik sat back, running a hand over his face, his fingers trembling slightly. "So I was never an orphan," he murmured, as if trying to convince himself. "I had a family, a real one." He let out a shaky breath, laughing bitterly. "And Monroe took that away too." Victoria didn't know what to say. She had spent her life navigating power, bending people and circumstances to her will. But this was something that couldn't be fixed with money or influence. This was a wound that had been left to fester for years, and now it was ripping open right in front of her. "Malik," she started carefully, but he shook his head, his jaw tightening. "No, don't." His voice was hard now, colder than she had ever heard it. "I don't want sympathy. I don't want to hear that it's going to be okay." She met his gaze, steady, unwavering. "Then what do you want?" He was silent for a long time, staring at the screen, his fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, but filled with something new. "I want him to pay." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Victoria nodded slowly. "Then we do this right," she said. "No rushing in, no mistakes. If we take Monroe down, it has to be permanent. No loopholes, no second chances." Malik exhaled sharply, looking away for a moment before nodding. "Yeah," he murmured, "no second chances." The screen in front of them still held more files, more details waiting to be uncovered. But for now, the most important truth had already been revealed. Malik wasn't just another survivor of Monroe's crimes. He was proof of them, a living, breathing piece of evidence that Monroe had tried to erase. And now the man who had spent his life running finally had a reason to stand and fight. Victoria barely had time to react before the first gunshot shattered the glass in the hallway. The explosion of sound was deafening, sending shards raining onto the hardwood floor as she grabbed Malik by the arm and pulled him toward cover. Her mind snapped into survival mode, every instinct screaming that this wasn't just another warning. This was an execution. Monroe had finally stopped playing games. He wasn't interested in threatening anymore. He wanted them dead. She ducked behind the kitchen island, her heartbeat a furious rhythm in her chest, hand already reaching for the gun she had started carrying since the threats escalated. Malik was beside her, his breathing controlled but his eyes wide with the weight of what was happening. "Stay low," she ordered, scanning the shadows beyond the hallway. "They're not here to scare us. They're here to kill us." Malik clenched his jaw, but nodded. He didn't need to be told twice. He had spent his life running, dodging, surviving. But this was different. This wasn't some street fight. This was a hunt, and they were the prey. Victoria glanced toward the shattered window, catching movement outside. 3, maybe 4 men, armed, tactical, not amateurs. They weren't just sent to handle her. They were here to erase them both. She grabbed Malik's wrist, yanking him toward the back entrance. "We need to move. Now." They darted through the house, each step careful, precise. Victoria's mind worked through a dozen escape routes, calculating the best way out before they were trapped completely. The security system was down, the cameras useless. Monroe had thought of everything. Another shot rang out, this time striking the doorway just inches from where Malik had been a second ago. He barely flinched, but she saw it, the realization settling into his bone. This wasn't about stopping them. This was about making sure he never found out who he really was. Victoria shoved open the door to the garage, pulling him through. "Get in!" she commanded, already reaching for the keys on the shelf. He hesitated for just a second, eyes flicking back toward the house. "We can't just run," he said, his voice tight with frustration. We have to survive," she cut in sharply. "We can't fight them here." She didn't wait for him to argue. She threw herself into the driver's seat and started the engine, the roar of the car cutting through the chaos outside. Malik slid into the passenger seat just as the first figure appeared in the doorway behind them. Victoria didn't hesitate. She slammed her foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the car shot forward, crashing through the partially closed garage door. The impact shook them both, but she didn't slow down, didn't look back. She maneuvered the car onto the street, gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Malik twisted in his seat, glancing behind them. "They'll follow." "Let them," she said, voice cold, controlled. "They just made the biggest mistake of their lives." He turned back to her, the adrenaline still sharp in his veins. "This is bigger than we thought," he said. "Monroe isn't just covering up a crime anymore. He's making sure no one ever connects me to him." Victoria didn't take her eyes off the road. "Then we don't give him that option." She drove fast, cutting through side streets, taking a route even she barely recognized. She had safe houses, backup plans, places to disappear if necessary, but that wasn't the plan anymore. Hiding wouldn't work. Monroe had proven that running wasn't enough. He would find them, no matter where they went. So the only option left was to make sure there was nowhere for him to run. "We expose everything," she said, her voice steady, final. "No more digging in the dark. No more waiting for proof. We put it all out there." Malik didn't speak for a moment, processing the weight of her words. Then finally he nodded. "If we do this, there's no going back." Victoria's hands tightened on the wheel. There was never any going back. The headlights of a pursuing vehicle flashed in her rearview mirror. Malik saw it too. "They're coming." Victoria smirked, adrenaline mixing with something darker. "Good." She pressed the gas pedal harder. "Let's give them a reason to be afraid." Victoria adjusted the collar of her blazer, her fingers steady despite the storm brewing inside her. The press conference was set, the media notified, the evidence ready to be unleashed. Every major news outlet would be present, eager to expose one of the most powerful men in the city. The USB drive sat on the desk in front of her, a simple object, yet holding the weight of everything Monroe had tried to bury for years. It was more than proof of financial fraud. It was a confession written in transactions, sealed with blood. It was the truth that had been stolen from Malik. And today, the world would know it. But just as she reached for the file that held the key to Monroe's downfall, her phone buzzed, a number she recognized, one she had expected to see sooner or later. She exhaled slowly before answering, keeping her voice sharp and controlled. "Richard." Monroe's voice was smooth, calculated, like a man who had never known desperation. "Victoria," he greeted, as if they were old friends catching up rather than enemies preparing for war. "I must say, I'm disappointed. I thought you were smarter than this." She leaned back in her chair, unimpressed. "You thought wrong." There was a pause, and then the shift she had been waiting for, the mask slipping, the true Monroe emerging. "I'm willing to make a deal," he said, "one that benefits us both." She let out a dry laugh. "Is that so?" because from where I'm sitting, the only person benefiting from anything you have to offer is you." Monroe ignored the jab. $100 million, he said simply. "Wired anywhere you want, no questions, no strings. You take the money, you walk away. You destroy the evidence, and you hand over the boy." Victoria's grip on the phone tightened. She had expected a bribe, but hearing it spoken so casually, so confidently, made something inside her coil with fury. "You really think that's all he's worth?" she said, voice dangerously quiet. Monroe chuckled. "Come on, Victoria. I know who you are. You don't do things for free. You don't fight battles that don't serve you. Whatever attachment you think you have to him, let it go. This is business, and in business, you take the better deal." She stared at the USB drive, at the documents that held the key to Monroe's destruction. Once, she might have taken the deal. Once, she might have told herself that Malik wasn't her problem, that she owed him nothing. But that woman didn't exist anymore. The moment Monroe had sent his men to kill them, the moment she saw the terror in Malik's eyes as they fled for their lives, something inside her had changed. She had spent her life building an empire, but for the first time, she was fighting for something that wasn't about power or control. It was about him. She smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of her lips. "You're right, Monroe. I don't do things for free, but I also don't sell my family." The silence that followed was thick, dangerous. Then Monroe spoke, his voice lower now, colder. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." She let out a breath, unbothered. "No, Richard, you did." And with that, she hung up. Malik had been watching her from the doorway, arms crossed, face unreadable. He stepped inside as she set the phone down, his gaze fixed on her. "You could have taken it," he said, his voice quiet, almost testing her. "You could have disappeared, taken the money, let all of this go." Victoria met his eyes, holding them steady. "I could have," she admitted, "but I didn't." He hesitated for a moment, as if searching for something in her expression. Then, without warning, he reached out, wrapping his fingers around her hand. "You could have sold me out," he murmured, voice barely above a whisper. "But you chose to fight. Why?" She looked at him, at the boy who had once been a stranger, a complication, a risk she never meant to take. And then she smiled, squeezing his hand gently. "Because now, you're my family." His eyes softened, something breaking in them that she wasn't sure had ever been allowed to break before. And for the first time since this all began, Malik didn't look like someone who was running. He looked like someone who belonged. Tomorrow they would go to war, but tonight they had already won something far more important. Victoria struggled against the zip ties cutting into her wrists, her breath coming in steady but controlled exhales as she forced herself to remain calm. She had been in high-pressure situations before, corporate takeovers, boardroom betrayals, moments where millions of dollars hung in the balance. But none of those compared to this. Monroe had taken her, not through backroom deals or political maneuvering. He had done it the old-fashioned way, force. She was seated in a high-backed leather chair, her arms bound behind her, the dim light of Monroe's study casting long shadows across the expensive mahogany desk in front of her. He sat on the other side, watching her with a cool, detached expression, as if she were nothing more than an unfortunate business decision he now had to rectify. "You should have taken the deal, Victoria," he said, his voice smooth, controlled. "I gave you an easy way out, and you threw it away. That was a mistake." She held his gaze, refusing to give him the satisfaction of fear. "You're the one who made the mistake, Richard," she said evenly. "You thought you could control this like everything else, like a deal, a hostile takeover. But this isn't business. This is desperation." He smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Desperate? No, my dear. I'm simply ensuring that my problems are taken care of before they get any worse." His eyes darkened slightly. "And you? You've become a very big problem." She didn't respond, her mind already calculating. Malik would come for her, she knew that much, and that was what worried her most. Monroe wouldn't hesitate to kill him. This wasn't a game to him anymore, it was survival, and men like Monroe, when cornered, were capable of anything. He stood, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt, as if this were just another business meeting. "I admire your resilience, Victoria, truly, but in the end, it won't matter. By this time tomorrow, the world will forget you. And the boy, well, let's just say he won't have to worry about his past anymore." He turned toward the door, giving a subtle nod to the two guards stationed there. "Keep an eye on her. I have a press conference to disrupt." Before he could take another step, an explosion rocked the mansion. The lights flickered, and the sound of gunfire cracked through the air. Victoria's pulse quickened, her body tensing against the restraints. Malik, he had come, and he wasn't alone. Monroe spun toward the door, his composed mask slipping for the first time. "What the hell?" Before he could finish, the door burst open and chaos erupted. Malik moved fast, his body low, weaving between the stunned guards before they had a chance to react. James Carter was right behind him, taking out the first man with a clean, precise shot. The second guard barely had time to reach for his weapon before Malik struck, slamming his elbow into the man's throat, sending him crumpling to the floor. Victoria didn't waste the opportunity. Using the distraction, she shifted her weight, twisting her bound wrists against the chair's wooden frame until she felt the give of the zip ties snapping. In one smooth motion, she was on her feet, her hands free, just as Monroe reached for the pistol strapped under his suit jacket. Malik was faster. He lunged, knocking Monroe back against the desk, sending papers and expensive trinkets crashing to the floor. Monroe let out a snarl of rage, shoving him back with surprising force. Malik stumbled, but recovered quickly. His eyes locked onto the man who had stolen his past, his family, his very identity. "You burned that orphanage to the ground," Malik said, his voice quiet but laced with fury. "You killed my parents. You tried to erase me." Monroe adjusted his jacket, his breathing uneven, but his smirk returned. "And I almost succeeded." Before Malik could move again, Monroe pulled. His gun, the barrel aimed directly at Malik's chest. The world slowed. James raised his weapon, but Monroe's finger was already on the trigger. Victoria didn't think. She moved. She stepped in front of Malik, her body shielding his, her eyes locked onto Monroe's. "It's over," she said, her voice unwavering. "You've lost." Monroe's grip on the gun tightened, his jaw clenching as if he were considering pulling the trigger anyway. But then he hesitated, not because he cared about killing her, but because for the first time he realized he wasn't in control. The evidence was already out there, already out. The press conference was happening with or without her. He had lost the moment she chose to fight instead of run. James took the opportunity. In one swift motion, he disarmed Monroe, kicking the gun away and forcing him onto his knees. Malik stood frozen for a second, his breath heavy, his hands shaking. This was the man who had taken everything from him, the man who had shaped his entire life without him even knowing it. "I should kill you," Malik muttered, his voice raw. Monroe smirked, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "But you won't." And he was right. Victoria placed a hand on Malik's shoulder, grounding him. "He's not worth it," she said. "Let him rot in prison." Malik exhaled sharply, then stepped back, his jaw clenched. "You're right," he murmured. "He's not." James pulled Monroe to his feet, securing him in handcuffs just as sirens wailed in the distance. The fight was over. As the police stormed in, taking Monroe away, Malik turned to Victoria, his expression unreadable. "You didn't have to step in front of me," he said quietly. She gave him a small smile. "Yeah, I did." He studied her for a long moment before nodding. "It's over," he said. Victoria looked around at the destruction, the bodies, the remnants of a war that had nearly cost them everything. "No," she corrected. "It's just beginning." Victoria stood at the courthouse steps, her posture unwavering as the world around her buzzed with chaos. Reporters shouted over one another, their microphones jostling for space, cameras flashing like a relentless storm of artificial lightning. But she didn't hear them. She only watched as the doors to the courthouse opened and Richard Monroe was led out. His hands bound in silver handcuffs, his carefully curated image of control and dominance shattered. His suit, once a symbol of his wealth, now hung limply on his frame, as if the very fabric of his power had started to decay along with his reputation. His hair, always styled to perfection, was slightly disheveled, a rare crack in the polished armor he wore for the world. But what struck Victoria most was his face. No rage, no desperate denial, just disbelief. As if, even now, even after the undeniable proof laid against him, he still couldn't comprehend that this was happening to him, that for the first time in his life, money, threats, and influence had failed him. She took a step forward, ensuring that their eyes met before he was shoved toward the waiting police car. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, locked in a silent battle of wills, but Victoria knew she had already won. Monroe had spent his life controlling others, ensuring he was always 10 steps ahead. Now, his entire world had collapsed beneath him, and there was nothing left for him to manipulate. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but laced with venom. "You destroyed my life," he said, his words clipped, seething. Victoria didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She simply let the smallest, most satisfied smirk curl the edges of her lips. "Now you know how it feels," she murmured. And just like that, the last shred of power Monroe had tried to hold over her dissolved into nothing. The officer behind him tightened his grip on his arm, forcing him toward the police vehicle, the door slamming shut behind him with a finality that rang through the air. Malik had been watching from a distance, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Victoria turned to him, expecting some kind of reaction, but he remained still, his gaze locked on the car disappearing down the road. He had spent years believing Monroe was an unstoppable force, an unseen hand that dictated the course of his life. And now, that hand had been severed. The power that had loomed over him like a specter had been reduced to a disgraced man in handcuffs, heading toward a prison cell. "It's over," Victoria said, her voice steady. But Malik didn't answer right away. His brow furrowed slightly, as if struggling to process the reality in front of him. Then, after a long pause, he exhaled. "For him," he muttered, "but for me, I don't even know who I am." Victoria studied him, seeing past the calm facade to the uncertainty roiling underneath. She had spent her life calculating risks, making decisions with ruthless efficiency, but this wasn't something she could solve with logic or strategy. Malik had spent his entire existence surviving, running, hiding from a past that had been stolen from him. And now, for the first time, he wasn't being chased. The fight was over, but survival was all he had ever known. "You have a choice," she said. "Finally, for the first time in your life, no one is deciding for you, not Monroe, not the system, not even me." He let out a small, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "And what if I don't know what comes next?" There was something raw in his voice, something vulnerable, something real. Victoria stepped closer, her voice firm but not unkind. "Then you figure it out," she said. "But you don't do it alone." He looked up at her, his expression searching, testing, and for the first time she saw something different in his eyes. Not just the weight of what he had lost, but the flicker of what it could come next. Possibility. He had never been given the chance to decide his own fate, and now the road ahead was empty, open, waiting for him to take the first step. "You spent your whole life trying to survive," she continued. "Now you get to live." He swallowed hard, exhaling as he nodded, slightly, as if accepting the weight of those words. The crowd was beginning to thin, reporters dispersing now that the spectacle was over. But Victoria knew this wasn't the end of anything. The headlines would come and go. Monroe would rot in prison, and his empire would collapse without him. But for her, for Malik, this wasn't just about bringing a man down. This was about what came next. "So what now?" Malik finally asked, his voice quieter, steadier. Victoria smiled slightly, glancing up at the city skyline, the place where everything had started, and where, for the first time, she felt like she had truly changed. "Now," she said, "now we start over." For the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about power or control or winning. She was thinking about something simpler, something real, a future that, for once, wasn't built on secrets, lies, or survival. And as Malik stepped away from the courthouse, leaving Monroe behind them, she knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just a victory. It was the beginning of something neither of them had ever dared to hope for, a life of their own. Victoria watched as Malik stood in the doorway of his new bedroom, his hands shoved into his pockets, his eyes scanning every inch of the space, as if trying to convince himself it was real. The room was large, but not overwhelming, decorated with a careful balance of warmth and simplicity. A dark, wooden desk sat near the window, a bookshelf filled with titles she had asked James to handpick, and a bed, his bed, positioned against the far wall with soft, untouched sheets that looked like they belonged to someone else. It was the first time Malik had ever been given something permanent, something truly his, and the weight of it hung in the air between them. She had expected him to say something, maybe make a sarcastic remark about how this was too much, too strange, too different from the life he had known. But he didn't. He just stood there, staring at the space that was meant to be his home. She stepped beside him, arms crossed loosely. "If you hate it, I can change things," she said, trying to gauge his reaction. He let out a short breath, something between a scoff and a laugh. "I don't hate it," he muttered, but his voice lacked its usual sharpness. I don't know what to do with it." He took a slow step forward, trailing his fingers across the surface of the desk, his movements hesitant. "I've never had my own room before, never had a place that was just mine." Victoria leaned against the doorframe, watching him carefully. "You do now," she said simply. "And no one's going to take it away from you." Malik exhaled, nodding, but she could tell the reality of it hadn't fully settled yet, and she understood. This wasn't just about the room. This was about everything. His entire life had been spent on the move, never staying in one place long enough to call it home. Even when he had lived at Ashwood, before the fire, before everything had been taken from him, it had never been his. He had always been temporary, disposable in the eyes of the system, of the people who were supposed to protect him. But now, for the first time, there was no expiration date hanging over his head, no one coming to take him away, no need to run. She walked further into the room, placing a folder on the desk in front of him. "I signed the papers this morning," she said. "It's official." Malik looked down at the folder, his fingers hesitating before he picked it up, flipping it open. His eyes moved across the document slowly, processing the words, reading the legal confirmation that he wasn't just staying here, he belonged here. Victoria Hastings had legally adopted him. His name was written there in black ink, binding him to something permanent. For the first time in his life. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the paper. He didn't look at her, but she could see the way his shoulders tensed, how he was fighting to keep his emotions in check. I don't know," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I thought you'd be done with me after Monroe was gone, that I was just a problem you needed to fix." Victoria didn't hesitate. She turned him toward her, making sure he met her gaze. "You were never a problem," she said firmly. "And I didn't do this out of obligation. I did it because you matter, because you deserve a home, because I wanted to." His jaw tightened, and for a second she thought he was going to say something sarcastic, deflect the moment the way he always did when things got too personal. But instead, he just nodded, his fingers still gripping the folder like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Victoria let out a slow breath, giving him space to process. You don't have to figure everything out today, she said. Hell, you don't have to figure it out tomorrow. But you're not alone in this, Malik. You don't have to keep fighting by yourself anymore. Malik set the folder down, rubbing a hand over his face before turning back to the room, looking at it differently now. Not like a place he was just passing through, but like something real, something his. It's weird, he admitted after a moment, having a future, not worrying about what happens. Next, Victoria smirked. You'll get used to it. He turned toward her, something unreadable in his expression, before he finally said, thanks for everything. It was the first time he had ever said it outright, without sarcasm, without hesitation, just the truth. Victoria smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder before stepping back toward the door. Get some rest, she said. We have a lot to figure out, and for the first time we've got all the time in the world to do it. Malik nodded, and as she left him standing there, staring at his new life, she knew one thing for certain. He wasn't running anymore. He had finally found where he belonged. Victoria adjusted the cuff of her blazer, watching from a few steps away as Malik shook hands with one of the university officials. His expression was composed, confident, but she knew him well enough to recognize the undercurrent of nervous energy beneath it. It was a big day, not just for him, but for both of them. Acceptance Day. The moment when incoming students officially committed to their next chapter. The campus buzzed with movement, parents taking pictures, students signing documents, professors engaging in polite conversation with the fresh wave of bright young minds about to enter their world. But for Victoria, none of it mattered. The only thing she cared about was the young man standing in front of her, the one who had once been a scared, stubborn 12-year-old pulling her out of a burning car, the boy who had spent his life running. And now he was standing still, facing his future with certainty. Malik turned toward her, rubbing the back of his neck. It's official, he said, his voice carrying that casual ease he always used when trying to play it cool. But the way he kept glancing at the papers in his hands betrayed him. Victoria smirked slightly, crossing her arms. You sound surprised, she said, like you didn't just spend the last 4 years proving you belong here. He huffed out a small laugh, shaking his head. I guess it still doesn't feel real. He looked back at the main building, the towering entrance to a world that had once seemed impossible for someone like him. A few years ago, I didn't even know if I'd make it to 18. And now, this. Victoria's smirk softened into something else, something rare, pride. It wasn't the kind of pride she was used to, the feeling that came from winning a deal or crushing an opponent. This was something deeper, something that couldn't be measured in numbers or contracts. You made this happen, Malik, she said. Not me, not anyone else. You. He looked at her then, his eyes steady. That's not true, he said quietly. None of this would have happened if you hadn't, He gestured. Vaguely, like the weight of what he wanted to say was too much to put into words. Victoria raised an eyebrow. Hadn't what? She pressed. He sighed, rolling his eyes, but not in annoyance. It was that Malik kind of eye roll, the one he used when he was trying to act unaffected, but couldn't quite pull it off. Hadn't fought for me, he admitted, hadn't stuck around. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The unspoken history between them settled into the space, the years of survival, of fights, of victories both small and life-changing. The battles they had fought against Monroe, against the past, against themselves. Victoria tilted her head slightly. You think I fought for you? She asked. He frowned. Didn't you? She took a slow breath, shaking her head. You never needed me, Malik, she said, but I needed you. The words landed between them with the weight of something undeniable. She had spent her whole life believing money was the only thing that mattered, that control was the only way to stay on top. But then, a 12-year-old had dragged her from the wreckage of her own arrogance and forced her to see the world differently. He had saved her, and not just that night. Malik swallowed, nodding once. He didn't need to say anything else. Instead, he did something he rarely ever did. He pulled her into a hug. It was brief, but it was real. and Victoria let herself return it without hesitation. When they stepped back, she cleared her throat, straightening her blazer, like it had somehow gotten out of place. "All right," she said, regaining her usual composure. "We should probably go before you start getting all emotional." Malik snorted. "Yeah, wouldn't want that." But there was something different in his voice. Lighter, more secure. Like, for the first time, he knew exactly who he was. As they walked back toward the car, Victoria felt something settle in her chest. It wasn't the thrill of victory, the high of a business conquest. It was something far better. This was what mattered. Not the money, not the power. This, a future built not on survival, but something stronger, family. And for the first time in her life, she knew she had finally won something worth keeping. What moment in this story touched you the most? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to Emotional Journey and give it a like. Every story we create takes time, research, and a lot of heart, and your support helps us keep bringing more meaningful content to you. Thank you for being part of this journey with us, and we'll see you in the next chapter.